Hello Charles Dickens, happy Easter, or at least happy Good Friday today, and happy Easter for Sunday. Today we are going to be looking at the Jewish festival of Passover. It's a festival that takes place at the same time, more or less, as Easter. It started on Wednesday. It is a really interesting festival, but it's also interesting in relation to Easter, because the whole reason that Jesus was there in Jerusalem at that particular time of year was that Jesus himself was Jewish, his followers were Jewish, and he was there celebrating Passover. The meal that he eats, where he tells Judas that he's going to betray him, the meal, the Last Supper it's called. You might know the painting where Jesus is sat in the middle. That is a Passover meal. So it really is important not only for Judaism, but for Christianity as well. So we're going to be looking at the Passover meal. We're going to be looking at a special symbolic meal that Jewish people eat called the Seder, and we're going to be looking at what each element of that meal means. But before we do that, I wanted to show you what's called a Haggadah. And a Haggadah is a retelling of the story of Passover. It's a retelling of the story from the Jewish Torah of Moses and of the Jews' escape from slavery in Egypt. And I found this really beautiful retelling of it. So let's watch that first, and then we're going to look at the Seder and how every element of that is symbolic, which means it represents or it symbolises something in relation to this story. So enjoy.
The Passover story in 10 scenes. 1. Long ago in Egypt, a mean ruler named Pharaoh makes the Jewish people slaves. They are forced to do hard work, building cities and pyramids. 2. Pharaoh orders all baby boys born to Jewish families to be taken away. But Moses' family floats baby Moses in a basket on the river. Moses' sister Miriam watches over him when Pharaoh's daughter finds the baby and brings him to the palace to be raised. 3. The Jewish people don't like being slaves at all. They are hungry, tired, and have no control over their lives. They cry out to God for help. 4. Moses, all grown up, goes out from the palace and sees an Egyptian treating a Jewish slave badly. He stops the Egyptian. Now Moses feels that he too is Jewish and runs away from Egypt. 5. Moses is herding sheep when he notices a strange bush. It's on fire, but not burning down. Amazing! He hears God's voice telling him to go to Pharaoh and demand that the Jewish people, Moses' people, be set free. 6. With his brother Aaron, Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh answers, "Never." 7. God brings terrible plagues on the Egyptians. Water turns to blood. Frogs, wild animals, and locusts are everywhere. People and animals get sick. Hailstones fall from the sky. Everything turns dark. After each plague, Pharaoh agrees to let the Jews go free, but then he changes his mind. Finally, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh frees the Jews. 8. The time has come. With great excitement and nervousness, the Jews pack their things and rush out of Egypt. They go so fast that the bread they are baking in celebration doesn't have time to rise. 9. The Jews think they're safe, but when they reach the Big Sea, they hear Pharaoh's army chasing after them. Pharaoh has changed his mind again. The Jews are trapped, but then a miracle happens. The sea opens up so the Jewish people can march across between two giant walls of water. 10. The sea closes up. The Jewish people are free. They sing and dance and celebrate. At Passover every year, we remember the miracle of freedom.
Okay, so we've just seen our Haggadah, which is a retelling of the story of Passover, a really important story for Jewish people all around the world. The next thing that they do when they're having their Passover meal is perform what's called a Seder. And a Seder is a symbolic meal. So that's a meal, they eat some of the parts of it, but the main purpose of it is to remind them of the story that they've just heard. And the different elements are different symbols. So we're going to look at what some of those symbols are and what some of those symbols mean. And it starts off with some bread. It's called matzo. And it's special bread. It's not just the kind of bread that you would be used to eating. It's bread that doesn't have any yeast in it. And because it doesn't have any yeast in it, it doesn't rise like normal bread would. Instead, it is kind of flat bread. It's the same bread that the Israelites were baking when they had to leave in a hurry after the Pharaoh decided to let them go. There are 3 slices of bread, or 3 matzo, they're almost like crackers, and a blessing is said over the bread. And it's the same blessing that Jewish people say at every single Friday night dinner that they have before the start of the Sabbath. Next, everybody gets 3 glasses of wine. So that's another symbolic item that comes from the Jewish Torah. And the wine is there as a celebration, and it's there to make people enjoy their evening, but it's also there as a symbol. The 3 glasses comes from the Jewish Torah. The next item that goes straight onto this plate, so you'll see there are 5 different spots. So if you're making this along with me at home, you can draw your own Seder plate like this. You can put your 5 spots on, and then you can write labels for each of the spots explaining what each of these different symbols is for. The next item that we get is the lamb bone. So I'm going to pop the lamb bone there. The lamb bone represents the lamb that Jews sacrificed at the temple. So it's very traditional at the time that Jewish people would take a lamb to the temple, and as a sign of respect to God, they would kill the lamb, and then they would usually leave that at the temple. And they took on the evening that this event that Passover commemorates happened, they took the blood from the lamb, and that's what they used to put over their doors. To protect themselves from the spirit of death that comes and kills all the firstborn sons. The next item on the Seder plate, we've got a roasted egg. There we go. Now, just like you have eggs at Easter, the reason for that is that it represents new life. It represents the cycle of life and death. And it's a reminder that even in very painful times, there can be hope of a new beginning. Even when the Jews were in slavery, they had faith and they had trust that slavery would come to an end. Okay, the next item on our Seder plate is horseradish. Now, you might never have had horseradish, but it's a very pungent flavour. It's a very, some would say, bitter or spicy flavour, and this represents a bitter herb. And the bitterness there is to remind Jewish people of the bitterness of slavery, of how horrible slavery was for the thousands of, or the hundreds of years at least, that Jewish people were in slavery in Egypt and in Babylon and in other places. So, next we have the charoset. The charoset is a mixture of different things. It's a mixture of fruit, honey and nuts. This is made, it kind of like makes into a paste, almost like the top of a crumble, and that symbolises the mortar that the Israelites used to construct buildings for the Pharaoh. So the mortar is like the cement that goes in between the different bricks. So the charoset represents the mortar. And finally we have parsley. That's the last item on our list here. Parsley is a beautiful green herb, and it's very, very bright green, and that represents the new spring. It represents looking forward to the warmth and the possibility of the spring that is to come. So that is kind of a sign of hope. So the egg and the parsley, those are like hopeful elements, looking forward to the future. I've forgotten one other thing as well, which is that usually at your table, as well as the wine and the matzo, you would also have a bowl of salt water. And the bowl of salt water is to remind Jewish people of the tears that they shed when they were in slavery. It's to remind Jewish people of how miserable and horrible and sad that slavery was. So the harisset, the horseradish and the salt water are to remind Jewish people of the sadness that they felt, the pain and anguish and suffering of slavery, but also to remind Jews that God released them from that slavery. God sent Moses, provided Moses with the help that was needed, and managed to get the Jews out of slavery, away from the Pharaoh. And finally, the lamb bone represents for Jewish people their devotion to God, the respect they show to God, the sacrifices they make for God, and that Jews have made for thousands of years. They would have killed that lamb in the temple as a sign of respect, and now we have the whole Seder meal, in fact the entire festival of Passover, where Jews show their respect for God. So that's a Seder meal. You can make your own Seder meal at home. All you need is a bit of paper, so you need some scissors to cut out your different parts, and you can label them. So for example, you could write a label here that says roasted egg represents new life. Obviously you've got much neater handwriting than I have, but there we go. So that is the Seder meal.